Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. It's time to take some of your questions, and our first one this week comes from Martin on the Patreon, who asks, given your recent criticism of the Speaker, I was wondering whether Canadians have ever had a take charge Speaker. When was the last time we did? For example, the UK Speaker seems to have much more authority and isn't afraid to use it. And also goes on to say that John Bercow is an example of one who arguably went too far, whereas the Australian Speaker has to manage a rowdy house and Canada does expel members, noting Bronwyn Bishop was notorious in ejecting members. So part of the difference is speakers in other Westminster legislatures or parliaments are often more empowered than ours are by virtue of their standing orders. Our standing orders have kind of neutered our speaker to a fair extent and haven't given him a lot of authority when it comes to doing things like calling out members when they are being blatantly untruthful, or things like that. The UK Speaker has been able to do that. The Australian Speaker, most especially, has been able to do that. Ours hasn't really, and that's a fault of the members for writing the standing orders in the way that they did, because they make their own rules, because that's what a self-governing parliament does, and the Speaker simply enforces the rules that are there. In terms of when we last had a take charge Speaker, it's been a while. Milliken tried to use humor for the most part because he was of the opinion that if he ejected members, then they would just go march out to the TV cameras in the foyer and get basically free airtime. And he didn't want to really give them that attention, so he tried to use humor more often than not, but that wasn't always terribly effective. Scheer, for all of his other obvious faults, would take questions away from a party at the end of QP if they were being too disruptive and there were too many interruptions. So he did that on a not infrequent basis, and his own party was not too happy about that at times. Jeff Regan also had ejected a member at one point, and I was there for that, and it kind of took everyone by surprise that he sent Blake Richards packing and basically gave him like the count of 5 before he got the Sergeant at Arms involved. And he did leave willingly. But that's the last time that's really happened. So that was 2 parliaments ago. So it's been a while. The current one, I wouldn't even say he quite uses Milliken's level of humor to try and bring things down. He's more, as I term it, the gentle chiding, Oh, we wouldn't want people to get the wrong impression. Oh, I'm sure the member didn't mean to do that. That kind of thing. And it's not terribly effective for managing the volume or the level of rowdiness in the House. But that's his particular style, and MPs voted to bring him back for a second term. So make of that what you will. And hopefully we can get some action in future parliaments to empower our Speaker much more so like the UK or Australia does. But that would be up to MPs to change the standing orders to ensure that that happens. Our next question is from Alan Park on Twitter, who asks, if the new convoy is the same as the old convoy and the local police and the provincial and the province demonstrate their previous competency, what are the odds of the ensuing misery ends up being handled in the same way, meaning the Emergencies Act, and or if we end up somehow worse off? I don't know that it is going to be handled the same way. I think the Ottawa police certainly have learned their lesson, as we saw with the quote-unquote Rolling Thunder motorcycle-ish demonstration a few weeks ago. They were much more aggressive. They cleared them out from Rideau Street when they tried to set up camp there. So I think we're going to see much the same. They've already started announcing what the exclusion zones for motor vehicles are going to be in downtown Ottawa. So I think it's going to be much less in the same kind of scope, because they're not going to be allowing trucks through the way they did previously. So that's a good thing. Also, when it comes to if things do escalate out of hand, I think the different police agencies have a better idea of what kind of powers are at their disposal. So I don't see it escalating to the same degree in terms of needing the Emergencies Act, because I think there's enough going on ahead of time that they know to head this off. Unlike the previous time where, somewhat inexplicably they didn't really think they were serious about occupying Wellington Street. They didn't really think they were serious about, staying there for 3 weeks plus. So I think now that they've seen that these people are certainly willing to do that they're less going to be as naive about it as they were previously. Our final question comes from Jackie Blue, who asks, why are process stories like SNC or Mountygate taken more seriously on the political shows than a national political party making friends with insurrectionists? Why is there more horse race coverage and pundit/strategist panels when than discussions with economists or national security experts? So there's a couple of things in there to unpack. The first one is that I don't consider those process stories. Process stories tend to be explanations as to why things happen the way they do, and kind of walking through procedural stuff. And most outlets are terribly allergic to that, which is not helpful for a lot of what's going on, because if people understood why things were working the way they would, we might get a better level of discourse. I think more with SNC and what's going on with the RCMP right now, those aren't so much process stories as there is this kind of element of trying to take a government down a peg. And it doesn't matter which government is in power. It's this instinct that a lot of reporters have, that if they can score, try and knock the government back, then it's kind of a win for them, and yay journalism. There is definitely a public interest in ensuring that this kind of stuff comes to light. I think it's not always done in the best way possible. I think there are instances where people are being taken much more credulously than they should be. For example, in this current RCMP situation, I think people are being far too credulous with what the RCMP is telling them. And in particular, this notion that they couldn't release this information because it would jeopardize the investigation. And there's been a lot of stories in the last 2 days citing experts who are like, no, that's ridiculous. And it's also kind of strange that you've got journalists who are saying the government shouldn't have pressed to release more information and been more transparent. That doesn't actually make a lot of sense, but they figure that if they can try and tie it to some kind of political interference, and they can again try and take the government back a peg, and it doesn't matter that it's a liberal government, it would have been the same if it was a conservative government. It's just whoever's in government. So that's kind of the thinking there, for what it's worth. In terms of why the political shows have these panels of pundits and strategists rather than experts, is because it's easy to do. They have a roster of these pundits or former staffers, largely, whom they term insiders, and they're easy to book, so they can fill airtime for them easily. They're reasonably cheap because most of them don't need to get paid, unlike journalists who appear on these panels. And sometimes experts can be difficult to book just by nature of, they have other obligations, or they're teaching a class at that time, or they have childcare issues, and they can't. It used to be they couldn't make it to the studio. It's less so in the era of Zoom, but it's harder to schedule them essentially. And you also have some experts who object to the way in which these panels tend to be structured, in that they try to get two opposing views rather than getting someone to explain the situation and having a more rational discourse. Instead, they're more interested in kind of the back and forth and trying to make it dramatic or interesting because they think that makes for good TV. It makes for poor news, but this is not their driving consideration, unfortunately. Similar with horse race stuff, that tends to be because they've commissioned polls, so they're trying to use them in as many venues as possible. They'll do it on print and then do a panel or so on what these poll numbers are. I have feelings about how much of our journalism is currently consumed by polls, but I'm sure you can pretty much figure out how I feel about that. But that's kind of the thinking behind why that happens. I'm not a big fan of it. I think it's cheapened the discourse. I think we're not getting much in the way of value for it. But that's unfortunately partially the economics and just the logistical realities of trying to do an hour or two of live television every day and trying to fill that space with something. And that's everything for this week. Join us again next week for some more Canadian politics. I'm Dale Smith. That's at journo_Dale on Twitter. And don't forget to like the video, share, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.